Welcome to panel 35A at the Development Studies Association. My name is Neil Webster. I'm the coordinator of the Governing Climate Mobility Program at the Danish Institute for International Studies. Lily is there as well, and Maya is there, and Nina is there, Francis is there, Desaline is there. These are all on the same GCM program, and you'll get to meet them during the 3 panels we have. There is also Joseph Tai from Accra. He will be joining us as well. The panel, I think, is very, very interesting because we're bringing different streams of thinking, fields of work together. The title, Unsettling Development, I think has all kinds of ambiguities to it. So I think that our panel has also a very good space or place in this conference because of the way that we're bringing different elements together and trying to look at things differently. Although we initiated it from GCM, in no way do we see this as a presentation of GCM. We need to learn, we need to share, we want to hear what others are doing and how they're doing it. And already after reading the papers, I think there are all kinds of interesting connecting pieces, threads, and many commonalities, which surprised me actually. So this is very good. Just to let you know that we have 3 papers today. We have until 4 o'clock, and I'm fairly firmly committed to stopping at 4 o'clock. That means that we will have about 15 minutes for each paper, the 3 papers. Just after each paper, we'll give the opportunity if there are any points of clarification. But after the 3 papers have been presented, the 3 presentations, we will then have a discussant, which we hope will be Francis, if he is with us. Francis is here at the moment. Who will take some 5 minutes or so just to pull out some of the threads maybe, or present thoughts on the basis of the 3 presentations made. And then we'll move into a more open forum with questions. Now, questions can be put up on the Q&A in the WOVA site. So I hope that you can manage to do that, and please write the questions up as you develop them. Don't wait until the 3 papers have all been presented. As the papers are being presented, please throw your questions. Also on the WOVA site, if you think another person's question is very good, you can actually like it, and that means that the chances of it being put, I think all questions will be put, but it certainly means that the question will be put. As I said, there are 3 panel sessions this afternoon, tomorrow morning, and tomorrow afternoon. I think we have some very good papers, hopefully very good presentations. I'm certain there will be. And I will convene this, and I would suggest that we move now to the first paper, which is Lily, who is going to present Shaping Spaces, Governance and Agency in Climate-Related Mobility. I think I have covered all the information I need to give you. I probably have neglected some point. So if you have any technical question, also put that into the question, and Kaylin, who is our technical assistant, will try and help with that as well. So over to you, Lily, please.
Thank you very much. All right, I think we're up and going now. So yes, as Neil said, I'm presenting the paper Shaping Spaces, Governance and Agency in Climate-Related Mobility. And this is a paper that, that Neil and I have been working on together. It tries to take up some of the themes in the Governing Climate Mobility Research Program. And here we'll just go on into the presentation. So the point of the paper, and as also of the kind of the program, the ideas behind it, is to develop our understanding of the role of governance in climate-related mobility. And so the program itself, we're kind of in the middle of the program, and this kind of main question that we always are returning to, research question, is how do governance contexts and interventions shape households and individuals' mobility decisions and practices in areas affected by climate change? And so in this, we're trying to, introduce this role of governance that I think is implicit in some of the literature on climate-related mobility. You know, when we talk about the many drivers and the many, you know, causal factors and so on, there's this, you know, in many ways, governance is implied. And so this is really to try and make explicit those discussions and trying to, you know, cast some light on those. And so we're doing this with our partners in Ethiopia from the Forum for Social Studies and from Ghana in the Center for Migration Studies. And so the main aims of, you know, of the program, we have that aim to integrate governance in studies of climate-related mobility. But for this paper in particular, to do that, we really wanted to kind of explore that interplay between political authority and governance, and then forms of agency. And so we're really trying to look at, when we're looking at governance in a non-normative sense, so in this analytical sense, and trying to introduce, you know, a broad kind of conception of formal and informal actors that in some way govern, that in some way, you know, affect, manage things like anything from the way in which areas are being impacted by climate change, who is affected and how. And then also questions of how mobility is considered or practiced. So the many ways in which governance can affect what's going on in terms of climate change and climate-related mobility. And so looking at, you know, the role of that interplay, that's what we're trying to focus on here in this paper. So our conceptual framework is drawing on diverse literatures. And as Neil was saying, you know, this is a process where we're really trying to explore things, to do some kind of analytical work, and it's kind of a, you know, in a kind of explorative way. So this is not to kind of put forward some very kind of clear framework, but rather to introduce literatures and concepts that can provide a good basis for innovative analytical work here. And so we're drawing on this concept of socio-environment to start with. And that's basically to say, as I think we all know, that this is not, I mean, often you see in very simplistic kind of presentations of climate-related mobility that there's, you know, this external environmental sphere, and then that somehow through climate change comes in and affects social practices, including mobility. But of course, you know, these are in reality very much imbricated and fundamentally linked in a variety of ways. So it's taking that as our starting point rather than looking at these things as very separate. So, you know, as we look out at the landscapes around us, you know, how did those landscapes come to be? You know, what does that mean for how people are experiencing climate change and who is experiencing climate change? And, you know, a variety of things around that. So climate-related mobility is linked to as a socio-environmental context and factors, and that also links to literature around a social vulnerability approach. You know, how is it that some people are affected and how? So just always kind of going back to that is a central concept. And then in terms of the interplay between political authority and agency, here we're looking at political authority, and that's to kind of open up governance. That can be formal or informal actors, you know, not necessarily taking our point of departure in formal structures, but going from a specific context and saying, how is authority practiced in this place? How are people affected by different forms of authority? And can that be, you know, traditional, informal kinds of authority? Can that be through other kinds of organizations, NGOs, international NGOs coming in? And then of course, formal governance actors and so on. So a variety of kinds of forms of political authority there and agency. And so, you know, putting that together to say that climate mobility is not a question only of individual or household agency, but how these are practiced and within the produced contexts and structures that are there, and political authority, seeing that as central in both of those 2 points. And lastly, we're looking at a mobilities perspective in terms of climate-related mobility. And there's an excellent article here on environmental mobilities. And here, looking at heterogeneous immobility and mobility decisions and practices. And here that also links to aspirations, capabilities, and power that lead us then back to that interplay again. And so these provide the overall approach. And then to look at how to examine that interplay specifically, we kind of, in our paper, we put forward this idea of, well, you know, would it be worth returning to social contract thinking? And again, that's not in a normative sense, but to say, what is the relationship between authorities and between individuals and households and so on? And so that's rather than kind of in a lot of the development literature that we draw on, you know, there are big major discussions of the role of democracy in a variety of ways, you know, whether that be procedural in terms of, you know, the procedures of the democracy with elections or so on, or whether that's substantive in terms of how is representation done. But rather than, which we also do draw on, but rather than necessarily only focusing on these conceptions of democracy that is strong in this literature, just opening it up to a social contract, to examining what that relationship is. And in that, we kind of pull out these three points of entitlements, aspirations, and empowerment that can be useful in this. And what was really interesting, seeing all the papers that came in, was that these are taken up in a variety of ways in several of the papers, kind of independently of each other. So that was really lovely to see, because it really seems like we've, you know, kind of really hit something right there, something that others also find relevant in this discussion. So with entitlements, we were looking to Sen and others in this literature to look at the factors that shape and determine capabilities. With aspirations, Apodrai and others exploring not only aspirations, but the capacity to aspire. I mean, and that's exactly going back to that interplay. So beyond simple aspirations, but also the policies, services, networks, norms, knowledge, and so on, and how horizons are kind of set. And then empowerment, and a broad range of discussions here, also coming out in the papers, addressing the way that individuals can become citizens, addressing accountability, forms of influence, and so on. And these points are kind of the themes that are taken up in the analysis, looking particularly at that interplay. And so to just illustrate this, I'm going to just take you through a couple of examples. And these are examples that are emerging from our data collection in Ghana and Ethiopia. And this is not to give an overview of our findings, but really just to give a couple of examples to try and draw these things out. And in Ghana, I'm giving an example today from Fentiakwa district in the eastern region of Ghana, which is in the southern area of Ghana. And here we can see, you know, this interplay between this broad social environmental setting, between agency and authority, the interplay there, and then mobility, how that's all playing out and interlinked. And so in socio-environment, we have this quote of a farmer just describing how when we were young, it was not as hot, and now it gets so hot, we find it difficult to work. The heat's also affecting cocoa yield and even destroying our food crops completely. And so, you know, just a variety of things coming out in that interplay between these social and environmental fields. Or spheres. And so how climate changes are coming in, you know, who they're affecting and how, in terms of livelihoods, in terms of the kind of livelihoods that what kind of agriculture in this area? Is it subsistence agriculture? Is it cash crop agriculture? And why is it, you know, how did that come into being in that way? And who has, you know, various kind of terms of access and so on, you know, that all are affecting how climate change is felt. And so then going into agency and authority, what we're seeing is land access and fertility emerging as key factors. And that's, you know, that evokes entitlement literature in terms of how we can look at that. And so further analysis might examine land governance as well as environmental management or adaptation or development initiatives as different kind of forms of governance that can be relevant here for shaping agency in this setting. And so what we're seeing in terms of mobility in our data, in this district, 60% of those interviewed were immigrants, and that was kind of an outlier compared to some of the other districts where we conducted data collection. And 70% cited, 70% of those cited availability of farmland or fertile soils as a main factor for choosing Fentiakwa as their destination. And over 30% cited a favorable climate for agriculture. But at the same time, you see forced immobility. So over 50% of households had a member who wanted to move but could not. And so a variety of linkages we already can see that we'll be exploring in our further analysis. And then in Ethiopia, in Oromia region in Sheshimane, we have a situation where farmers and their families are speaking about having to travel further for water, crop yields being reduced, changes as a link to changes in temperature and precipitation, and food insecurity increasing. And at the same time, 94% of respondents have cultivation as a primary livelihood. And for many, it's their only source of income. And so here again, it's that socio-environmental context of climate change having an influence in the interlinkages between these things. And of course, things like access to water, food insecurity. We know that these are central areas of governance in many contexts. And then agency and authority. So, I mean, just to start actually in the bottom point here, 90% of those interviewed here stating lack of employment to be a serious or very serious problem. And, going from that, I mean, I think a lot of times when we're talking about mobility in terms of climate change, there's this, we're put into this narrow box of adaptation, perhaps. And here you can see that, not only are we talking about perhaps improved agriculture extension or better water management or social protection, but it's also a question of local employment and opportunities linked to a variety of entitlements, empowerment, and aspiration. And so for mobility, that would indicate, and again, this is something that we'll be exploring further, mobility that accesses other sources of income will be a key instrument in terms of managing these many kind of changes and interlinked factors. And so 30%, 37%, we can already see are migrating seasonally to urban areas. 29 are migrating seasonally to other rural areas, and 10% of households have migrants internationally. And so we can see that there may be these quite relevant linkages to explore going forward. So that was just to draw out a couple of examples of how this might look in, to illustrate why we think it might be useful to really focus explicitly and try and draw out the governance aspects at play in shaping how climate change is being felt, and shaping how mobility might be considered or practiced, and perhaps throwing out some analytical tools that might help with that. So we hope very much that leads to a very useful discussion, and also looking forward to seeing how that links also to the other papers and presentations. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lily. And the paper has been sent out. There is a lot in the paper. So comments there. Thank you very much for keeping very good time as well. You're 2 minutes under 15. I don't know if anybody has any specific points of clarification they would like to take up. Nobody has put anything into the chat box. So please don't just think of points of clarification right now. Think also of questions that you would like to have addressed later on. Okay, if that's the case, then I suggest we move to the next paper. And this, I believe, is Jivan and Arabella. Am I correct? Yes, please.
Okay, hi. Hi.
We can hear you loud and clear.
Oh, perfect. And do you have access to my presentation?
We can see the presentation as well.
Nice. Well, sorry, Ari, do you want to start?
No, Jivan, you go and I'll come in at the end, but absolutely.
Thank you. Well, I just want to say hello to everybody present and really express my gratitude for give this opportunity to attend this panel and share the ideas in this specialized forum, and with this for this lens that you provide to analyze our experience in a comparative way. And I am sure, and I am waiting for the result of this important analysis that is very constructive for the research of the study and the understanding of these matters. So, well, this is our presentation. We prepared this as part of the doctoral thesis that I'm working with in the Polytechnical University of Barcelona. I am geologist of the National University of Colombia with a master in philosophy in the University of Granada. I'm currently doing these doctoral studies. And of course, this includes the contribution and the background of Arabella Fraser, who is with us in the room. Well, we are talking about an important disclaimer. This is a part, an important part of this presentation is incorporated from the publication Global Views on Climate Relocation and Social Justice, Navigating Retreat, a compilation which is available and where we contribute with Ari and with another colleague here in Spain. We contribute with one chapter that with a similar title of the presentation. Okay, so we are going to talk about the critical perspectives on landslide relocation and measures in the informal settlement of Bogotá, Colombia. So this is some of the topics that we are going to cover. Hopefully, what is Arrigo? Some definition of Arrigo with capital letter and Arrigo without capital letter, which has some difference from our view. Something about the configuration of risk in Bogotá from the perspective of the risk as an exclusion of nature, the risk as a result of a chain governance failures, and all summarizing what we could call the social constructions of risk. And then talk about some spatial relationships between risk, poverty, and mitigability and relocation. Describe briefly the relocation program in Bogotá, and then contrast that with some perspectives about risk from Arrigo with capital letters and from Arrigo without, to move into conclusions. Okay, so regarding Arrigo, we regard Arrigo is a platform of around 30 organizations founded in 2016 with the aim of reinforce the accountability in the relocation processes of the city, especially advocating for the human rights protection of the people in these conditions. But also, as well, Arrigo is an expression in Spanish that literally means rooting, which denotes an organic relationships between the inhabitants and the space they inhabit. This tree standing in the ruins of a relocated house is a good metaphor for evoking this human process of Arrigo, as it unfolds in the very same way that the former inhabitants who were there in that ruins. So it is like inherent of the living beings to establish roots. Some of the faces of Arrigo. This is real life persons who are the subject of these relocation measures and are presenting here in some of his testimonies, who is very more developed in the paper, in the chapter. This strong relationship with the space, and in particular in this organic way, which is the particular nuance that we like of the concept of Arrigo. Of course, a similar concept is used in the Anglophone scholars, would be place attachment, that refers to the associations of meaning and emotional affections with place. But in this case, the etymological relation of Arrigo with roots is an image that we would like to preserve, because more than a superficial attachment is something that is developed and penetrates the space where the people establish. Well, some about the risk and the exclusion of the nature. I want to explain what does it mean. Let me start by contextualizing some of the Bogotá and introduce reflections of the history of the city and how climate risk has been configured. So in the right border, you may appreciate the urban expansion of the city from the middle of the 90s in the upper image to the year 2000 in the bottom. Then I invite you to compare these two images in the centers. Above, a beautiful painting elaborated in the colonial time, illustrates the lands, the water bodies, and the floodlands of the former villas of Bogota. And just below, you can appreciate a mapping exercise of the city authority on risk management, indicating the spatial distribution of flood events report obstructing the terrestrial traffic of the city. One first question is how much these flooding events, which are in fact intensified by climate change and variability, how they show spatial patterns correlationable with the pre-existing natural structure illustrated above. How the superposition of urban development occur, like underestimating or omitting or excluding the pre-existing natural landscape, inaugurating by this way an environmental conflict that is still persisting. Well, in this case, we can figure out how governance is determining a systemic climate vulnerability and an adaptation of the city. In the expansion accomplished, stimulate or tolerate without sufficient consideration the natural dynamics. In general, in this case, it's also evident. Well, I would like to previously to say that we may realize in this way how much the risk is a product resulting from the governance failures manifest in low technical and operational capacities for stewardship or properly take care of natural dynamics of the landscape. But also there is a technical and operational capacities in question to control the urban expansion of the city, or even an absence of willingness to exercise an appropriate control. So additionally, we can also appreciate how there is a reduced capacity to provide planned urban soil and formal housing in response to the slashing migrational dynamics accelerated by the internal violence in the country, the illegal drug business that everybody in the world knows, and the trend imposed by an hyper-centralized scheme of administration. The bars show the urban expansion of formal and informal settlements from the 1950 to 2000, by contrasting the formal and informal production of housing between the 60s and the 90s in Bogota. That if we balance that with the curve of poblational increment, which is below in the right corner for the same period, that results surprising how the public administration react inversely, with a significant reduction in its capacity to provide formal housing in front of the exponential increasing of the population. Usually some water, sorry. Usually, informal occupation of urban soil is denoted as illegal, and associated with criminal activity and land traffickings, even with the complicity of the populations that don't reason in the consequence of illegally occupied soils. What we can appreciate in these numbers and graphs is that probably all these informal activity and illegal markets associated are just a natural reactions in front of a structural failure in the governance. I just mentioned that a chain governance failures make reference that we are talking about a failure in front to a history of failures, as all these dynamics of internal violence, of migrational dynamics, of illegal drug business, and the hyper-centralization are already failures of the governance system that are respond with a chain, a new layer of failure. So there is a social productions of the risk. We suggest that thinking in terms of this social production, we contrast here here the regulatory map demarcating the landslide susceptibility with the distribution of informal settlements in the city. A very usual explanation is that the poorest population have a restricted access to soil in the city, which is driving them to occupy the risky areas. But we invite you to think that this soil susceptibility just informs about certain conditions of the landscape to be taken into account for urban development. Risky areas are not pre-existent, but configured as long as the occupation occurs, as we have seen, well determined by the access to soil and different variables. This landslide susceptibility map well, and in contrast with the informal settlements, show about this, talk about this situation. So again, the risk areas are not pre-existent, so have to deal with these important responsibilities that are related to governance failures. Just summarizing. Okay. So we keep with some spatial analysis of the different information to add some insights on this regard. You already know this landslide susceptibility map in the left, and let me introduce you in the right hand the map of the landslide non-mitigable areas. It means, in short, that these are spaces. These are spaces where landslide risk conditions have implied relocations and establish a total restriction for residential land use. We also have in the center a map of average household income for the city. So if we move one into another, the average income over the landslide susceptibility and the non-mitigable areas over the average income, the evidence insinuates that a strong correlation with the non-mitigability and the low average income of the population. Whether or not the different average income urban developments intersect the susceptibility, the non-mitigable conditions will correspond primarily with the low income. This manifests a clear situation of spatial injustice, which quests not just the distribution of poor settlements in the urban areas susceptible to some risk, but the distributions of the social production of the risk that we have been insight on, and the distribution of the mitigability. It means where the states recognize to have the capacities to intervene the risk conditions. We have here some definition of the mitigability that is defined by the authorities as the condition when it's not, the non-mitigability is where it's not economically feasible or socially or politically to intervene the risk. Well, there is some numbers about the relocation, which is a program that consists in coordinated actions and activities to reach the managed retreat. And I just want to, to insist here and in these numbers. This is in like 15 years later of having this goal of 10,000 housing units to be relocated, and then restructuring that goal to another 12,000 housing. In 2016, we just have 4,100 housing units definitively relocated. So in 2020, there's an important number. The government authorities are reporting 26,000 new informal invasions in the city. In these terms, in the term of invasion here is important. These numbers show like how the production of the risk, the causal vectors that we have discussed all remain unresolved and unattained, and so remain producing and expanding the risk conditions. well, it's some perspectives from the voices of Arrigo, how the people recognize the governance failures, how the people recognize the different dynamics that we have been describing. Ari, I just let you time for your conclusion because we are almost finishing.
Thank you, Jivan, so much. I'll try and come in with some conclusions. I just wanted to say this is Jivan, sorry, my video isn't starting, so I'll talk, but this is based, this work really on a really long history of engagement, particularly by Jivan in the city as a city engineer and as well as an academic. But yeah, sorry, my video is not working very well, but what we wanted to convey really was that out of these testimonies from Arrigo, this citizen's perspective, is really revealing of the kind of very narrow focus of governance on reducing risk by reducing the exposure. And the kind of ideological bias that comes across in some of these technocratic discourses. So that's just promoting relocation. So a singular focus on a singular type of mobility, really. And Lily's got me thinking in all sorts of directions about multiple forms of mobility really productively. So thank you for that, Lily. But obviously what's coming out of Arrigo is a much broader view, we think, and it is about aspirations as well as empowerment. And that also reveals this failure really of the public and private actors to take responsibility for equitability really in distributing risk across the city. And something that Jivan's always stressed in his work is that this leads to the reproduction of permanent states of risk despite relocation. And I think having had this really long durée kind of engagement with the city, I mean, I first started working there in 2009 and Jivan before that, we are now really saying that we can really see this. So the voices of Arrigo caution against this kind of authority. Interesting that we've also picked up on authority, but not theorized it as yet. And I think it would be interesting to take that further. But it's conferred to even surpass basic rights. Arrigo speaks to attachments to place. It speaks to the need for due recompense and respect for livelihoods. So that's often a very strong contestation in the resettlement process. And again, the importance of local perceptions, both on risks and on concepts such as mitigability. So we're really kind of pointing to Arrigo as a citizens' movement that's channeling a voice to reinterrogate the basis of managed relocation, how we redefine its use for reshaping urban space for social justice, echoing calls that have come from other places in relationship to science policy about the need for humility towards the technologies we have, and for refocusing resilience and relocation towards the rights and entitlements of urban citizens and addressing the causes of risk beyond just simply looking at the physical or ecological infrastructure. So community platforms and networks such as Arrigo can play a vital role in making visible the human impacts and informing the ways that relocation policies can be implemented. But it would be interesting to discuss further as well what the challenges and opportunities for those kind of community-led forms of authority are in different contexts. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Jivan and Arabella. You nearly had the right time. Are there any immediate points of clarification? I mean, this is a fascinating paper. I've thrown one question up, but I have several more which I want to put, but I'm the convener, so I'm not allowed to put too many. But I think this raises some very fundamental issues about the organization of governance, hierarchically, in silos, and forms of, should we say, empowerment, engagement from below, etc. Do we have any points of clarification to the paper? I have nothing in the chat that I have seen yet, because if not, then I would suggest we move to...
Divya raised her hand.
Sorry, oh, a hand raised. I haven't...
A physical hand raised.
Sorry, who's raised their hand? Whoever has raised their hand, please speak.
Just a quick clarification. I mean, again, really fascinating presentation that you said. My question was whether, I mean, I see there's a lot of second sense of attachment going on in the context of Arrigo. So I was wondering if there is an informal institution versus a formal institution that is functioning or that is operating in
do you want to take that question now, or do you want to note it and take it up in the discussion, Jivan and Arabella? I'll give you that choice.
Jivan, up to you, but Neil, it'd be interesting to come back, wouldn't it, to these informal and formal forms of authority. And actually that's more the focus of new work that Jivan and I have been discussing, and particularly noting Jivan's point about the role of mafias and kind of extra state forms of authority in these areas. And that's something we're keen to explore further in how that weaves into this construction that it's not as simple as formal state versus informal organic citizens movement, most certainly not. Exactly.
So that was half an answer, but we'll take that forward into the discussion, because I think it also feeds also very much into Divya's presentation and the whole role of Panchayati Raj and Panchayati Raj institutions in different states in India. In this case, it's in Uttarakhand, if I remember, sorry, Himachal Pradesh. Am I correct, Divya?
That's correct.
Okay, in the mountains. Excellent. You have 15 minutes to take up Panchayati Raj, please. Divya, are you there? Is it just me, or have we lost Divya?
I think we may have lost Divya. Oh, there she is again. She's connecting back now.
Hi, Divya. We lost you for a moment.
Yeah, it was surprising.
Do you want to put your share your screen, or do you prefer that we do it from here? Okay, fine. Please, 15 minutes or so.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I am really looking forward to discussing this paper that my colleague and I are working on. And this idea is still at a very nascent stage. I just wanted to check if everybody is able to hear me fine.
I think we can hear you fine.
Okay, perfect, thanks. So yeah, as I mentioned, this is the idea that my colleague, Dr. Harris Fisher, and I, we've been thinking about, and it's still at a very sort of like a nascent stage. So we are hoping this panel to be a way for us to sort of discuss this idea with a larger group, and also find ways to dissect and unpack the idea more. In this paper, we will be, I'll be sharing, some aspects of my empirical observations of last year's lockdown experience in the mid-Himalayan region of India, specifically in the state of Himachal Pradesh. And through my observation, I would highlight the role of the movement in people's lives, and also the role of the local government, which Neil, as I mentioned, the panchayat. So I'll highlight that through my presentation, and I'll show that how it took a lockdown for all of us to realize the salience of movement in people's lives and also livelihood. So with that, I'll move on. COVID-19 in India, the last year, the way it started, it was, while the rest of the Western world, US and UK and Europe was going through this massive surge in the cases and massive rate of fatality, India was still sort of on the slower path. Yet the Indian Prime Minister on March 24th, 2020, he went on the national television and announced this like dramatic nationwide lockdown. And as a result of that, there was this curtailment of all movements, like a shutdown of all the activities. And all of this had a really significant impact on the poor. And this was mostly because a lot of, especially the wage laborers, who were dependent on, the opportunities, the financial opportunities, like all the wage labor related opportunities, through which they make daily influence. So in our field side also, it was not very different. What happened is that the borders were shut. So on the map I showed, this represents where Himachal Pradesh is in the northern part of the country. So in Himachal Pradesh also, it was not very different. It's the same story, like all the borders were shut of the state, of the districts, and all the villages. And as you see in the picture, this decision was overnight, and it was dramatic and drastic. So there were these a makeshift arrangements of barriers that were created to sort of regulate the movement. All the public transport was suspended, and instantly, there was these arrangements for creating temporary quarantine centers that were set up. As I mentioned, all the commercial and private establishments, industries, government offices, schools, and everything was closed, and social distancing was something that was mandated. So yeah, as I mentioned, I think this was the time when it just became evident how movement is important, not just for the social, but also the economic system, and how with the lockdown, everything, the entire balance is kind of thrown off. And at the same time, it was also interesting to see that governing the lockdown and mobility was not very easy. And that was primarily because there was a lot of uncertainty. Nobody knew how long the disease was going to last, how it's going to play out. It was so complex. And also, there was this lack of historical experience, especially in the region where we were working. There was this lack of experience, so people did not really know, especially the administrative level. There was not much awareness about how to effectively deal with this kind of calamity or this kind of crisis. And it was just not possible to plan in advance or to know how to mobilize quickly. So in that situation, the local government or the local government became a really important actor. It kind of stood out as this actor which was facilitating the process of response at the local level. They're also they were also serving an important sort of bridge between the policy measures and the local realities. And in a way, they were facilitating the coordination of responses to COVID-19. Based on some of the theoretical claims, we know that the local government has been perceived as a more legitimate actor than other external actors because they are more closely connected to the public and better able to navigate context-specific local conditions. So they are better positioned to mobilize key local actors. In the case of India, as Neil mentioned, we have this Panchayati Raj system, and these local governments are known as panchayats. And they, as part of the 73rd Constitutional Amendment, they've been enshrined into the Indian law. And as per the law, the panchayat bears the responsibility for a variety of functions related to rural development and other administrative functions. These panchayats have elections every 5 years, and that is monitored by the State Electoral Commission. And there's a system of reservation. So reservation, I mean that so the way the panchayat committee is constituted, they have a provision to reserve or to say or have a quota of seats for women, for low caste members from the low caste community, and also from the indigenous ethnic groups. And there's a growing array of social programs with respect to rural development in India. And they're all being placed under the control of the panchayats, and that has made them a center of local political power in many localities. So the local government and governance, in the time of the COVID-19 was, as I said, it kind of became very, very salient how these local governments and panchayats had an important role to play. And it was mostly because, as I mentioned earlier, there were these barricades that were placed. And it was mostly, and it was again a really important step because that was the only way to regulate who was entering and who was going out. And also it was a way of for them to keep a record of that and make sure that they were checking up to their families and seeing that, health-wise if they were okay and, monitoring their health and all these things. Also, there were, as I mentioned, since everything was shut down, a lot of people, they lost their jobs. So these local governments or these panchayats are playing a really important role to sort of protect those people who lost their income due to loss of mobility. And how that was happening was that there are these, we have rural employment programs, and these rural employment programs were implemented just within weeks, the lockdown was enforced. So it was the panchayat's responsibility to ensure that these rural employment programs were implemented in a way that they were following the lockdown protocol, and also sort of providing means of sort of financial support to people, and which this financial support was a huge respite, especially for people who were dependent on wage labor. At the same time, since I mentioned earlier, the public transport was suspended. So these panchayats, the local government, were also playing a really important role in coordinating the transportation of the public goods and also for personal essential goods. At the same time, March, unfortunately, was the time when farmers were harvesting or were getting ready to harvest their crops. That was the time when they sell their harvest, and that's the time when they make money. So since the public transportation and all kinds of transportation was shut down, these local government bodies, these panchayats, were also sort of really instrumental in coordinating transportation of farmers' harvest to the market. And overall, the panchayats were coordinating with all the government departments, and they were relaying ground level information to the higher level administrative level. And this was really fascinating, at the time of the whole lockdown to see, we talk about decentralization, we talk about democracy, but the reality in the case of India, the way the political system works is that it's mostly like top down, very hierarchical. But I think it took the lockdown for us to realize that how important it is to have, these functional decentralized systems and to have them operating all the time and be more empowered. And it's especially at the time of the crisis, it's the salient of the crisis and highlighted as we see that, how if we have to address the crisis on the ground level information or the ground level whatever, like data and knowledge can only be relayed through these institutions. So overall, all these things that were happening have sort of highlighted the role of both movements as well as the role of the local government. So as I said, mobility is a really important fundamental driver of rural development, and it is really key for accessing all kinds of services, health services, education, employment, and we didn't realize how important it was. Especially for me, we always thought that there's mostly for the livelihood and that people migrating for jobs and things like that. But then when everything was shut, that's when we realized that how mobility is so central to our life. And this is not only applicable, to be honest, in the rural context, it's also applicable in the urban context as well. So with that, I'll just wrap up saying that, the only certainty that we have about the whole pandemic, the lesson that we learned through this pandemic, that the only thing certain is the uncertainty, and that we're not really aware how this uncertainty is going to play out. It makes sense, it's just makes practical sense to mobilize and sort of empower these local institutions, the local government. And the role of local government, it's a really important role in facilitating local response during the stress like COVID-19. So overall, we are working together in sort of putting together ideas, in sort of conceptualizing and also highlighting the role of movement and the role of local government in dealing with not just crises like the COVID-19, but I think that these lessons will also be helpful to also understand the responses that the communities they form at the time of any crisis, like the climate stress or other risks, because it's the Himalayan region and it's vulnerable to lots of levels of shock. So I feel like the lessons from this research will have potential to not just prepare or sort of prepare the plans and inform policies in terms of COVID-19 response, but also in terms of addressing or thinking about crisis dealing with the climate stress as well. So that I'll wrap up. Thank you.
Great. Many thanks, Divya. Very interesting. Panchayats are fascinating for me because I've worked with them. Okay, Francis, before I ask you, Francis, are there any points of clarification to Divya's paper? I have perhaps one point of clarification. Panchayats are elected and they have reserved seats for women, for minority groups, scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, et cetera, Yep. Okay, that was just a point of clarification because I think it's quite important, possibly for subsequent discussion. Any other points of clarification? Okay, Francis, are you there? Well, you are there.
Yes.
Can you?
Hi,
great.
I'm there.
Great. Good to hear you.
Yeah. Okay.
Please, Francis, you have 5 to 10 minutes.
Okay. Thanks. I'd like to thank the presenters for a very beautiful presentations, and I really enjoyed the 3 papers. The common themes that run across these 3 is governance and mobility. Very interesting. And all these 3 reflect governance failures and also how mobility plays important roles in the lives of people across the world, and how in this absence we will have extreme difficulties to be almost reinventing life. So in the first paper, we see how the authors try to bring different concepts to try to explain climate-related mobility. I think this is an innovation because we have seen various attempts to explain climate mobility over the last few decades, and these have often taken up one or a few concepts that did not really give a comprehensive answer. So coming all the way from climate refugees, and then with all the problems that we had with trying to give numbers to people that might be moving, and all the false information about mass migrations. Now, of course, we have come beyond that, and we must consider issues of agency and know that not everyone affected by climate circumstances will migrate. Immobility is also an important dimension of climate mobility, which this paper highlights also. But of course, it's important that they capture also the informal governance, which is often ignored in most people who look at governance. But in developing countries as Ghana, informal spaces are very important in shaping the spaces that help people to adapt to climate change and also to make different kinds of decisions. So, of course, how access to land and all different kinds of things. Even if the formal government was coming up with strategies, informal governance structures will determine who goes out there and who does not go out there. That's very crucial. So I think also looking further to add a historical dimension to it, and how over time different governance initiatives have shaped and different processes that have come to give us a contemporary space that we now see how different actors behave, but also how different cultures of migration, of mobility have emerged over time, and how they still influence migration today. That is very crucial. So I think that it's important probably to also look a little at other key actors of in the governance space. They may not act directly, but some big NGOs or multinational might somehow have some connections or act by themselves, but which goes to influence the space within which people make their mobility decisions. So that was really great. And I think that when we look at the second paper, The Voices of Arrigo, very interesting paper, reflects, speaks of an important topic about the urban poor, their vulnerabilities to environmental stresses, and of course, environmental change. So this paper reflects the imperatives of governance failures, how that influences migration and urban expansion. And then what is rather interesting here is that much of the literature reflects vulnerable people who settle in places that were not legitimate. But this also tells of a situation where we have also formal settlements. But once now we have vulnerability assessments, they will have to be relocated. And I think it's very important dimension. But more generally, the paper draws attention to maladaptation in terms of climate adaptation. So the question will be, are we going to pay a big price for maladaptation one day? Should we do something now, or should we wait? And it also draws attention to much of the developing world where people suffering from climate stresses are already moving also to marginalized lands and are further causing environmental degradation. What will become of them and the environments? What should we do? That was really great. And I think it also highlights the need to engage communities in shaping resettlement strategies, which is very crucial, of course, not least for the issues of social attachment and how they also want to see themselves beyond the relocation, which is very crucial. Usually you have planners making these kinds of decisions, but it's time to really engage people much closer. So of course, the paper enables us to question the nature of climate relocation policies, but also to think of strategies as, that's very strategy as one that is inevitable in much of the world, maybe in the future. Then the third paper, very interesting, which also of course focuses a bit on governance and mobility, but it focuses on mobility in unusual times. That is what makes it really important and crucial. So what we see here is that it looks at the role of local governance and governments. And what we see is that the focus has often been on national governments in the developing countries, passing on information to the local governments and telling them to do. So a very high level of subordination. So what we need to do is to encourage further local governance autonomy in a certain sense. And of course, because they understand the local dynamics better. So we see here also when they discuss that rural urban spaces are hybrid spaces, and these linkages are very crucial for particularly rural survival and progress. So we then need to think beyond governing mobility in usual times. We need to go beyond and start thinking much more further. This is COVID-19. What comes next? Maybe it's not a pandemic, maybe it's something else. But, so I think this paper really brings for something very crucial for us to think about. Neil, I think this is what I have to say of the three papers.
That was very good, Francis. Thank you so much. And you did keep almost within the time limit as well. What I would suggest is that the three paper, or there's more than three in fact, if you just have a quick response. I mean, there is this discussion going backwards actually with Dibya, because it did strike me as well that the central government threw the problem onto local government, and local government had to respond, and local government, as we identified, is elected. At the same time, next door, you had more than 4.5 million, should we say, Hindu devotees in 3 days bathing in the Ganges. And now you've got this tremendous situation. And that tension between central and local, and between the individual pursuing its rights and the needs of the collective entity, whether it's community or village, whatever, I think it is fascinating. And I think it's also a little bit there, Jivan, if I can take the question I put up and add it to what Francis has said, because it strikes me it's a very technocratic approach, which is being taken by local government to actually define what is the problem and who are the problem, which would seem to suggest a major kind of failure in, shall we say, citizen engagement by local government. And how much is that politically driven, elite driven, and how much is it driven simply by the way that administrations are organized and the technocratic way which they approach these problems and define these problems? For instance, the type of soil, whether it's soil which can be constructed on or not constructed on. And Lily, I will not, because I'm responsible, so, but please, if you begin with that, and I would welcome more questions being thrown up, whether you want to put your hand up to raise them or write them. But please, let's take a round first. So if we start with the middle, so we start with Jivan and Arabella. I don't know if you have any comments to Francis or to my question, and then to Dibya, and then to Lily. And in the meantime, please think of more questions and indicate if you would like to ask.
Well, I think the question, I think that encloses very good the problem that we were pretending to present, which is actually the total authority that is being given to technical process that is dominating the whole approach of the society to the problem of the risk, for while the underground causes that are in the bottom of the lack of, for example, for the housing, to provide housing solutions for the important proportion of immigrants that are still arriving to the city. And for example, now in the middle of the conflict that we have with the neighborhoods like Venezuela, and there is not a response. There is not an organizational architecture of the city that is responding to these underground causes, and it happens in the national and in the local level. So really the countries in general and the societies of the development countries, probably as part of the adaptation agenda, require very much an assessment and a support to reinforce their governance structure and to adapt really that capacity of the institutions and or the necessity to create new institutions. Because by the way, many of the institutions that we have are like a copy and paste from other kind of systems. Or even I used to say to some politicians that we govern the hills of the city like that hills were like plain, but they are not plain. They have rivers. They have, so it's not only a technical but institutional adaptation to the landscape that we need. And to finish, in terms of the second question about the political force that the relocation and these people has in the agenda is very low, and the strategy of relocation is, in my opinion, like dividing the possibility of these local communities to organize and to get into a common arena to discuss, like, and to reinforce the political power of the citizens to bring these incomes to the discussions. You know, Ari.
Oh no, absolutely. I just want to add a couple of things very quickly. I mean, one is about the political culture, I think, from Colombia to understand. And you know, the relationship between knowledge, expertise and the state, it's a kind of, and particularly I think the conflict affecting that governance culture in Colombia, there's a long tradition of kind of governing through this kind of technocratic expertise. And you don't necessarily even find that in neighboring countries. So I've been working on another project in Ecuador where my colleagues and scientists tell me that's not the case. There's a much more open culture of deliberation. So it's quite interesting to put in comparative perspective. And the other thing is about governance fragmentation. And I think that's what Jivan is also pointing at. So the very fragmented nature of formal governance. So, you know, different institutions, this is not a singular state. There's a huge plethora of state institutions operating on these landscapes with very narrow mandates. So the kind of governance vision that Jivan is pointing to is something that's much more integrated.
Neil, you're muted.
Yeah, Divya, sorry about that. There is also the question on the chat. I don't know if you've seen it, from Naya. She writes a question to Divya, really interesting paper. I was wondering if you could say something about migrants in relation to COVID-19 lockdown, both in terms of returning or stranded migrants. So over to you, Divya.
Thanks for that question, Naya. I mean, it was a really sorry state, to be very honest. And what was really highlighted, and I want to sort of mention here in this forum, that what was really highlighted was that in terms of migration, there was a disparity, between the urban migrant versus the rural migrants. And the whole pandemic situation kind of revealed that when the lockdown was imposed and when the migrant communities in the urban centers, so even in the urban centers, the migrant communities are the ones that, these are people in the rural areas who migrate into urban, bigger cities and urban centers for making money and for financial reasons. So what happened was that in the urban centers, when the lockdown was imposed, these people were struggling a lot because, again, they live in this hand-to-mouth situation. So what was really disturbing at the time was that, all these news reports about these mass exodus of the migrants, walking hundreds and hundreds of kilometers from Delhi, from Bombay, and from these bigger cities back to their villages, because again, they felt that they would be better off being in their own sort of in their own homes, the native places, versus living in the cities where the situation was so uncertain. So that was the case of the urban migrants. And in the case of the rural migrants, there are two kinds of migrants. That was again, I'm not a migrant scholar, but it was again, since we've been working on the pandemic, these are the things that that we are observing. In the case of the rural migrants, there are two kinds of migrants. One who sort of migrate to the urban centers, and the ones who migrate to to maybe not that far of a place. Regardless, both migrants, they were struggling, especially so the ones who migrated to in longer distance to further places, they struggled the most because it was really hard for them to come back and be with their families. But the ones who had also moved to not too far away, places not too far away, it was a little bit challenging for them because, as I mentioned in my presentation, there were these restrictions on entering and it was not easy to enter. Even if you were the resident of that village, you had to undergo some sort of health checkup and be quarantined. And that was something at the outset people were not very they were not in the favor of being quarantined and stay at the quarantine centers because they were just desperate to be with their families, and nobody knew how the situation at the quarantine centers was. So, so the situation of migrants, be it these urban migrants or the rural migrants, was really bad. But especially the urban migrants was even worse because not only were they really far away from their families, but then the whole like food security and the income security was just like, you know, was just in deep crisis.
Just to follow up on that a little bit, because I think if I understand it correctly, basically the urban migrants were losing their access to work. So they were losing their basis for remaining in Delhi or whichever city in Mumbai or maybe Calcutta even. To return to the family was to return to a livelihood which could potentially support them in some form of subsistence way. But on the other side, and this is again linked to governance, and I think it's quite important to some of the discussions, is what kind of provision existed in Himachal Pradesh, because we know that health expenditure in India is around about 2% of the national budget, and most of that does not reach rural areas such as in Himachal Pradesh and so on. So in fact, it does create a major crisis, but it's not just bringing the illness back, but it's actually, although it's pursuing livelihoods to try and maintain themselves through a more subsistence-oriented production, maybe, it's also actually undermining the livelihoods because it's introducing the illness, etc. I mean, we can't go into this in detail now, but I think it's a very fascinating, complex example, and one which we need to take up in a number of other environments. I mean, we're experiencing it not least in Ethiopia and in Ghana in terms of the research and so on. Lily, over to you, please.
Thanks, Neil, and thanks for a really interesting discussion. I've kind of made some notes along the way, and I'll just try and pick up some points. So I think one of the things that's coming out really across the papers is how mobility is shaped by political authorities in a variety of ways. And I mean, with the Governing Climate Mobility Research Program, we're trying to look at situations of slow onset climate change, but the other cases that you guys have brought up, I mean, it's very much more explicit in a way that also can perhaps make things, you know, even more evident. And I think as a Divya, what you were saying about mobility, being a part of daily life, I mean, I think, you know, for us, we're a lot of scholars coming together in this program, and a lot of us not from migration and mobility studies. And I think that that's also been, you know, extremely important, especially, you know, when we're looking at situations of climate change and the studies of that. A lot of us are not coming with that perspective and that understanding of how integrated these things are, you know, as of mobility and livelihoods and so on. And it's funny because for myself, when I've looked over, you know, notes from previous research, I see it coming out clearly once I have these kind of these glasses on, you know. And so then what you say about how in unusual times, then it becomes managed in particular ways or addressed or problematized or so on. And, you know, in terms of COVID or in terms of climate change. And I think that's really interesting, then linking up to the other presentation, this idea of, you know, political cultures, because the role that as a political authorities can play or might play in terms of how environments are shaped, how mobility is perhaps shaped, is very much linked up to the political culture that is. And we also in that kind of brought up the role of a variety of institutions, formal and informal, and the overlaps between them, because so often there are. And I think, you know, also what was brought up, this kind of what is, you know, the formal institutional kind of, what is the formal state? Well, I mean, it's a variety of institutions, it's many with, you know, various mandates and so on. So that in itself is also quite complex. So not seeing that as some kind of, you know, coherent whole, but looking at that as something much more diverse. And then linking that also, you know, to cultures of migration, which Francis also brought up. So, you know, in a way, you have this meeting of a variety of things, and some are quite implicit in terms of specific programs, very clear measures that are coming out. But there's also this undercurrent, both of the cultures of migration and the cultures of political authority, which I think is very interesting. And I think in terms of climate change specifically, you have this kind of, that Jivan and Arabella brought up, this kind of, you know, rendering technical as it is in the development literature of making something, I mean, it's hugely political, where people can live, what they have access to, their access to their own land that they've been on for generations, for instance. But, you know, now there's a technical risk assessment and suddenly they're displaced from their land. And so, you know, that whole process of something that's as extremely political, depoliticizing it, making it technical, and at the same time legitimizing that. So I think, you know, when you come into this space of climate change and what we're seeing in climate change adaptation, and I've looked at cases of resettlement before as well, I mean, you just see these tendencies. And it's also, you know, going back to that with the social and environmental spheres, sometimes it's very much linked to that, you know, this is something external and environmental. And as soon as it becomes something external, it's not about the policies we've had, you know, it's not about our environmental management, it's about none of that. It's just this external environmental kind of impact, and we can't do anything about it. I'm sorry, we're going to have to move you, you know. And so this whole, what can happen in that space of, and going back to how it's defined, I think is a really interesting question that's coming up. So that's some first thoughts.
Very good. Excellent. My problem is I've got two screens, you see. I've got you down here where the camera is, and I've got you up here with your PowerPoints and the and I have to get my arrow across. They don't quite match, but that's my technical challenge. Sorry, Joseph. I just got a message from Joseph. Did you want to ask a question, Joseph?
Right, so I have put a question on the chat that I can ask it. Something
Please do.
Something that we can reflect on. And thank you so much for all the excellent presentation. My question goes more to Lily. If we can, I just wanted to know if the analytical framework will also focus on what Giddens called the duality of structures. And this is important to me because, in other words, if the structures and the agency interact to shape migration decisions and migration flows, for instance, local cultures, patriarchal norms, and all the other things can facilitate migration, and they can also impede migration, for instance. And then are we also going to look at how migration in turn come back to influence these various structures? So for instance, people have migrated and they've come back, or they are away and they still continue to talk to people. Are we also going to look at how migration will in turn impact on these structures? So that is something I want us to look at as far as the very excellent conceptual framework you presented is about. Thank you.
Lily, do you want to take that question?
Yeah, I'll take it directly, and I can give you my own thoughts at least, but I think, you know, this would also be a very good place for discussion. But for me, at least, I think that's hugely important. And I think that, that's one of the reasons for many of us that are not coming from literatures on migration or mobility, that we're becoming much more aware of this. And because I think that's quite right, that you know, that migration, I mean, in the sense that this is part of daily life and daily practice, that, you know, that's part of constituting not only the relationship between subjects and authorities and so on, but I would very much expect, you know, and again, this not being my background, that also is part of influencing the way that as a political, economic, socioeconomic structures are constituted, what, not only, because we've talked about this before, some of our colleagues that are, as migration scholars, you know, what happens when you have a hometown association that's, you know, with, you know, this is an association that's created, linked to a diaspora, linked to return migrants, and, you know, that has a specific, as a particular role locally, I mean, in terms of local development, local politics, and so on. So I think, you know, things like that, that's a very explicit example of how that might be. But I think also in a range of other kinds of socioeconomic structures that I think that's hugely important, Joseph, and a very good question. And I think when I think about that literature on practice, I mean, coming from kind of more governance literature as I do of state practice, that, you know, institutions are kind of built in a way on practice. One thing is, you know, the nice, you know, policies and regulations and so on, but, you know, if the reality is the practice, then I think that's a very good link with what you're pointing out here, and only one of many, but yeah.
If I can put my other hat on as co-author of the paper. I mean, thank you, Joseph. It's a very, very good question, because it's something which I think even within GCM, we have not very different positions, but we come to that discussion from different perspectives. And I think it's true in the papers here as well. Some of us looking more at formal government, some of us looking more broadly at governance, some of us looking to the role of informal networks, informal institutions, the tension between local government and, say, paramount chiefs or religious leaders, etc. And how is it that decisions are being made about mobility and different types of mobility, whether it's to another rural area on a seasonal basis, whether it's to an urban location, whether it's to a Gulf state, etc. And what we're trying to work with here is to say, how do we bring agency and structure together? How do we actually explore the way that these spaces are being created, which is why we called it Shaping Spaces, the paper. And you'll find that, I mean, it's quite interesting. We found that there were a number of theoretical tendencies, I think we can call them, whether it's entitlement, whether it's empowerment, whether it's capacity to aspire, which all in one way or other raise this tension between, should we say, governance institutions and individuals and households. And that's why we end up in the paper discussing social contract, because it's a way of bringing, not talking in general terms about democracy, etc. I mean, I think it's very interesting talking about representative democracy, for instance, or forms of accountability, etc. But trying to get into this exploration of the relationship between individuals and their households and their livelihoods and, should we say, structural and institutional factors that very much shape. And in fact, the question I also put to Jivan and Arabella a little bit was to say, you know, that tension, when is it that the interests of a collectivity like a municipality should take precedence over the interests of an individual house owner on a hillside? Now, I know that there are a lot of political issues involved in that, about voice, et cetera, but at some point, isn't there a question about, should the individual be allowed to do whatever they want to do when it may have costs elsewhere? And again, this comes back to the social contract, because it's not just between the individual and the state in the form of local government or what other form of political authority. It's also between citizen and citizen. Should I pay taxes so that that guy can live on the hillside, which means that I'll have to spend all my taxes, or somebody else will, to actually dig that person out when the hillside comes down? I don't know. I mean, that's a very simplistic way of looking at it, but that's why we came into the social contract discussion in the paper. We're now trying to work through the empirical data, and that's fascinating. At the moment, we have 4 times 4. Well, I better not say any more, because this is all going to come up in other panels, and I must not do that. It is now, we have 15 minutes left for this session. Originally we had another paper, but unfortunately that dropped out. Are there further questions, or can I throw it back to the 3 papers and their respective authors? I've got, your question came up on the chat on the Zoom. I don't think there are any more questions on, Naya and Nina. I have 2 questions here, so I read these out. Naya asks, thanks to all presenters. Following up on Francis's great comments, I think another cross-cutting theme is the relationship between forced or desired immobility and forced or desired mobility, whether in relation to forced relocation or forced immobilization during COVID-19. I would be curious about your thoughts about this. Obviously, Divya, that's a question which addresses you more directly, but it may well be that Jivan, Arabella, and Lily have a thought on that. I will then also put Nina's question here, and then the 3 paper givers can round off. if I don't see any more. Nina writes, it sounds to me that Zhang Bao's concept of shock mobilities corresponds well to some of the aspects mentioned in Divya's paper. And the second question asked by Naya, that's the question I just mentioned before or presented before. Biao finds that social inequality is exacerbated by COVID-19, by the middle classes being able to afford immobility and work from home, the poorer losing their jobs, and those in between entering into irregular delivery babor. I think that's labor, sorry. Into irregular labor, often delivery, etc., which is what we've seen in recent times here. So those questions are up on the Q&A on the WOVA site if you want to read them yourselves. Lily, I will let you start first.
Thank you. Okay, so just going directly to Nina and Naya's comments and questions. So, and again, this is, you know, as you can hear from Neil, we come at this from a lot of different literatures and views, but I mean, on the linkages between forced and voluntary immobility and mobility. And, you know, as Neil's saying, we're also, you know, we're going into the data right now and have started working with it. So a lot remains to be seen. But I think what's clear is that, you know, there are linkages between immobility for some and mobility for others. And I think what would be, you know, in the sense of if one household member is, as it goes to work as labor, seasonal labor, perhaps in a nearby town or something to support the livelihoods of those at home or just to support the livelihoods of the household as a whole. And what I wonder is, I think it's really interesting the way you put it, Naya, about raising it in terms of the as a forced or voluntary. And I think, you know, I think it'd be extremely interesting to look at that in terms of, you know, both the governance context. I mean, and I think that goes back to the cultures of migration and the kind of, you know, kind of governance context, because I mean, there's very, I think, going to be some really interesting social dynamics, I would assume, of, you know, cultures of mobility. Who is it that migrates in a household? And if that's a household decision of perhaps, you know, perhaps putting this simplistically, sending one person to migrate, you know, who is that socially that is most likely to be the one that is sent to migrate, for instance. So I think that there would be some really interesting things to examine there. And then what Nina writes about shock mobility. Yeah, I don't know that I have any particular comment to that, but I think it's relevant to bring that up. And also, you know, as we were talking about before with Divya's case, I mean, where you do have this, you know, very clear kind of situation of an extreme shock. I mean, in terms of also bringing that back to climate change, I think it'll be interesting, you know, to look at this gray area, because we often put it up in terms of, you know, extreme events and slow onset events. And of course, you know, then you have situations, I have a colleague here that's looked at situations of recurrent smaller floods, for instance, you know, and so, you know, all of these areas in between. So that'll be interesting to look at and kind of those complex realities. And I'll leave it there. Thank you so much for the wonderful panel today.
Thank you, Lily. Divya, I'll let you.
Thank you, Neil. I think this idea of forced versus designed mobility and also immobility is just like so fascinating and also very thought-provoking. I mean, I'm just like thinking, it's giving me just like goosebumps thinking about it, how when this lockdown, which is supposed to stop and halt all the movement, it kind of like, you know, triggered movement too, especially in the people who were away from their homes. So in a way, this designed immobility also triggered mobility, although it was sort of like, you know, temporary. And then also I wanted to clarify that, you know, especially in the context of Himachal Pradesh where I was working, when we think of migrant laborers, not really like migrant laborers, I shouldn't say migrant laborers, I should just say like, you know, the migrating population, it conjures this image of like, you know, these really rural household members who are migrating to a bigger city, you know, to make money. But then at the same time, you know, there's also population there. There are people who aspire to migrate out, you know, out of their rural areas, out of their villages. And so there are also people who are migrating for more like, you know, steady jobs. be it in like government services or like school teachers or university or like for higher degrees and things like that. So they're these two kinds of migration that is happening. And then as again, like as Lily said, like not being a migration sort of like researcher or a migrant study researcher, these are the things I found to be very striking, because again, although I was aware of all these realities, I don't think I paid too much attention in seeing the disparities or the distinctness between the different kind of migrating population, and then also like thinking about the role of mobility and the role of sort of like this forced immobility on different population. And then when the lockdown happened, it was not just these rural the migrant laborers who were coming back. It was also these like people who had steady jobs who were sort of trying to come back. So I think it's really thought-provoking. I think it's worth pursuing this idea of forced versus designed mobility and immobility, especially in the time of the COVID. And as Lily was mentioning, that there's definitely scope of unpacking and exploring these ideas, even in the context of climate risks and threats. When there are landslides happening, when there are like earthquakes happening. I mean, the region where I'm working, it's also like prone to earthquakes, and that causes like severe damage and crisis. So it's also sort of like worth exploring in that context as well. The other thing I wanted to mention, like this is something that Neil, you brought up earlier, was about the fate of the people who are migrating. So I just wanted to highlight that my colleagues and I, we recently published a paper where we talk about all these different levels of responses that were triggered because of the lockdown. So we talk about the individual level responses, the collective level responses, and also institutional level responses. And institutional level responses was like really interesting because we saw that how some program, some social security programs like the food entitlement program, it played a really important role because again, with the lockdown, both livelihood and the food security was in a very risky situation. So the food entitlement program that not only provided like an increased subsidy, but also sort of like distributed free food, and there were more entitlements that were made to make sure that people were accessing food. Again, it was not perfect. There were problems, but again, in our study, we noticed that these social security programs, although they were scattered and patchy, they made a lot of difference in sort of like providing that basic sort of like safety net or cushioning to these vulnerable population. And I know I'm kind of like I'm scattered brain right now, but it's just like really fascinating to think about all these different aspects that that everybody in this forum has been raising, and I think I'll be thinking about that for a very long time.
Thank you so much, Divya. And Jivan and Arabella, please.
Hello, I'm going to come in to start off with, also agree with Divya, this has been really productive, and these binaries of thinking push us, don't they? They're useful, even if we like to blur them, and these really resonate as questions. And the reason I'm going to speak first is just it speaks quite strongly to work that I did quite a long time ago in Bogota, but which was a household survey. So it was trying to get a kind of cross-sectional analysis across 3 communities about risk perception, livelihoods, and kind of motivation and agency, really, and really map that onto responses to some of this relocation program, which has really stayed in its current form for a very long time. And so just a couple of things very quickly. I mean, this is effectively a forced relocation program. It claims to be voluntary, but those kind of political claims, I think, have to be understood often for what they are, and coming in after disasters and kind of telling people they have to move, it becomes de facto forced. But it does cut across different aspirations, particularly in very heterogeneous urban populations where the social dynamics are indeed very dynamic. So it cuts across the aspirations often of poorer groups, and that's what my survey kind of maybe showed up the obvious, but certainly the newly displaced, people who were just there in shelters, you know, to suddenly be cut across by a relocation program was actually a kind of livelihoods opportunity. And I think Arrigo emerges, and that form of resistance emerges perhaps from longer term dwellers often, who have invested significant capital, often fought for legalization struggles within their communities, built up different attachments to kind of home and community, but also significant material investment. So that's a little bit of a response to the way poverty dynamics are also underlying some of these differences in aspiration and responding to kind of what's forced and what's desired. And that just leads to the final question that one for the future, really. Well, how do you enable then in policy, you know, those who aspire to move or to leave, to do so in ways that are equitable and, you know, are supportive of their livelihoods? And that question's kind of bedeviled me. I've seen very few examples from kind of disaster and adaptation relocation. There is a tiny case study from Bogota of where, you know, it was government working with community. So communities there was one group, they generated their own savings, they had very charismatic leaders. So there's a lot of politics around that. And they were then able to work with the Ministry of Housing and define a new housing kind of project for themselves. But that's a really isolated example. It was very hard for other groups we met, and Jivan and I were together doing some of this research, other community leaders in a political context in Bogota where formal community organization can be very difficult. To then organize in this context was also very difficult. So those are very isolated. And Joseph, I thought your point was fantastic. What I'd love to see is, can we also get back to the ecological impacts? That's not expertise I have, but we could tentatively from Bogota start to say something about the ways this has also enabled ecological transformation through urban parks, where the authorities have then come in and kind of ecologically transformed areas, but also ecological deterioration, where then kind of park communities have been left to their own devices, and there's been further erosion and further disasters. So it's a tale of both stories from anecdote, but that would be kind of fascinating to pursue. But thank you. Jivan, do you want to add?
I have some little point to add about this convenience of a voluntary approach to, like, kind of a voluntary approach to the natural conditions for housing. I think that we should bring into the table some, like, the convenience of a convivence with risk. And it's paradoxic with this, because this is the kind of approach available for some of the wealthy segments of the populations. And that they, with a strong capacity of investment and technology, are available to make their living and the convivence with extraordinary landscapes, and take joy and take an advantage of the ecological services. And I think we should not go to the extreme, but in fact, like a society, many of the technologies and the processes that we need to have a convivence with the risk and with the natural landscapes of the city are many of the adjustments that in an agenda of adaptation we as a society need. Thank you.
Great. I was just checking I wasn't muted. Thank you so much, everybody. And I mean, when you leave a panel feeling there are a lot of things up in the air and you've got 2 more sessions to go through, then I think that there's going to be a very, very good set of discussions coming forward. So thank you all very much. I'm very impressed with the way you manage the technology as well, because these conference platforms, particularly when it's got 2 interfaces, both Zoom and Wova, it's not that easy. So I think you've done brilliantly. Thank you so much. Tomorrow we have the second panel, and that will be convened by Naya, and then one of our colleagues from Ethiopia, Zerehun Mohammed, he will be the discussant. That's in the morning. And in the afternoon, we have a panel where Lily will be the convener, and Joseph Tai, who you heard earlier, he is the discussant. And I can assure you there are some very, very interesting papers being presented, which, interestingly enough, draw on quite a lot of the things we've already thrown up into the air today, I think. And some of those have begun to maybe settle down in a more, should we say, in a constructive way. So thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the day. Enjoy the rest of the events in the conference if you go to those today, and look forward to seeing you all tomorrow. Thank you Thank you very much. Thank you, paper givers, and thank you, participants.